Inquisition is kind of court. In fact, the way in which courts operate in continental Europe and in the countries colonized by the countries of continental Europe is called the inquisitorial system, as opposed to the adversarial system, which operates in former British colonies. In the adversarial system, which probably most of you are familiar, as this video is being recorded in English, you have two lawyers who argue the case on either side of the guilt of the defendant, and then the judge ensures that the law is observed and understood correctly in the course of the trial, and the jury judges the matter of fact. In the inquisitorial system, the judge takes a much more proactive role in actually investigating the crime and trying to determine for himself whether it has been committed or not. And so that form of tribunal, an inquisitio, is what the Inquisition of heretical depravity was. That's the actual name of the institution. It gets called the Inquisition, but that's just an abbreviation of the Inquisition of heretical depravity. It could be the Inquisition of excessively old pastries or something instead, or of larceny on the high seas or something like that. But as the way these things happen, it got contracted, and so the term has become associated specifically with this ecclesiastical tribunal. So the tribunal in question exists in order to examine the claim that some individual or individuals are guilty of heresy. Heresy is both a crime and a sin. The sin and the crime have the same definition: the obstinate post-baptismal doubt or denial of an article of faith revealed by God. It's not possible, therefore, to commit heresy unless you're baptized. If you're not baptized and you make up some random religious falsehood involving various deracinated details of Christian revelation, that's not, strictly speaking, heresy. Sometimes people will say that Islam is really a Christian heresy, but there's no evidence that Muhammad was baptized, so that's not strictly true. In the same way, Mormonism, at least nowadays, isn't really a Christian heresy because Mormons are not validly baptized, although Joseph Smith, I suppose, was probably validly baptized. I haven't looked into the question. So, the sin of heresy is when you privately, as an individual, obstinately, after your baptism, doubt or deny an article of faith revealed by God, but it's not a matter of public record that could be vindicated in a court. So you happen to pick up a copy of the decrees of the ecumenical councils, you're flicking through it, you notice something that you don't like, say it's Trent's definition that the state of perfect continence or consecrated virginity is happier and more blessed than the state of marriage, and you think that's obviously ridiculous, and you check, did Trent definitely say this? Is Trent definitely an ecumenical council? Are anathematizing canons of councils definitely infallible? You satisfy yourself, yes, they are, and you still think, no, I'm sorry, I'm just not buying that. You just committed the sin of heresy, but nobody else knows because it was just you, Google, and the decrees of the ecumenical councils who were present when the sin occurred. Don't do that at home, chaps, because you will forfeit the theological virtue of faith and die in your sins. But nevertheless, it's not a crime because it's not a matter of public record. So the crime would occur when you, say, published an article in which you disparaged and rejected or treated as a matter capable of doubt that particular dogma of the Council of Trent. You were then corrected by the bishop of your diocese or the Holy See, and you still refuse to retract the opinion which you expressed in the article. You would then be guilty of the crime of heresy. Crime because it's very wicked, and it's a matter of public record such that you could be held accountable for it before a court, of course, in this case, a canon law court. Now, why is heresy so serious? Many saints and fathers have said that it's the most serious and terrible of all heresies. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, no less, a disciple of St. John himself, in one of his epistles, he remarks that that adultery in his time was punishable by death. because it corrupts and destroys the household, which is a very important, vital building block of human society. And therefore, surely it is legitimate for heresy, which corrupts and destroys the holy faith itself, to be punished by an eternity of punishment in hell. So he's definitely pretty down on heresy. There are many other saints and doctors and that one could quote on this subject. So the reason why is because it is uniquely damaging in the harm that it does to others. When people are damned because they didn't have faith, they are not damned in most cases probably because they heard the faith and rejected it. They are damned because they never heard it. And it's not actually the fact that they never heard it that causes them to be damned. It's the fact that they committed a whole host of other sins. In fact, if they never heard the faith, they're not specifically guilty for having rejected it at all. But because they never encountered the faith, they never received the opportunity to repent and to have their sins forgiven by the blood of Christ, and therefore they were lost. St. Paul says, an obligation lies upon me to preach the gospel. Woe upon me if I do not preach the gospel. It is a great failing in us if we fail to propagate the gospel, because Christ died for all men and he commanded us to preach the gospel to all nations. But as we mentioned, some heresies are so extreme that they actually invalidate the baptism practiced by those heretics. As we mentioned, Mormonism. So the existence of Mormonism causes an immense amount of damage because a lot of people will encounter the gospel in that form, and therefore either they will think that it's risible and be alienated from the gospel, or they will embrace it and it will not do them any good, but they will think they've embraced the gospel when in fact they haven't, and therefore they will be in their sins, and the possibility of hearing the gospel from an authentic preacher will be greatly diminished in their case. So heresy, almost uniquely among sins, damages the possibility of salvation for other people without those other people actually committing any more sin than they otherwise would have done. And that's why it causes more harm than any other heresy, any other sin. Now, it also is exceptional in that it has a unique personal malice involved, because as the truths of the faith are necessary for salvation, the necessary for a meritorious moral action of any kind, God gives us, along with the gift of faith, supernatural certainty concerning its truth, so that we can endure martyrdom, so that we can resist any temptation against the faith. As St. Thomas says, the believer more firmly assents to the articles of faith than to the first principles of reason. That is, the believer, although he doesn't know why it's true, he knows that the articles of faith are true more certainly than he knows that a part is smaller than the whole, or that the same thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. That's why the great martyrs of the early church were able to endure such appalling torments without denying the faith. And 20th century and no doubt 21st century martyrs as well. So that means that in the rejection of the faith, the refashioning of it into something else, the heretic is uniquely subjectively culpable in a way that is reminiscent of the fall of the angels at the beginning of time. It's a more terrible sin committed with higher personal culpability than any other sin. So the word heresy comes from the Greek word heresis, meaning choice. That's because what the heretic is doing, he's being a cafeteria Catholic. He's thinking that he can pick and choose what he believes. That's not permissible because, as I said before, we don't know why the truths of the faith are true in most cases. I mean, there are truths which we can demonstrate by natural reason, but then if we do that, we're not believing them on the strength of faith. The central truths necessary for salvation, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the revelations about the various sacraments, these are not things that can be known by natural reason. We believe them with this incredible certainty because they are revealed by God, who is infinite in all perfections and can neither deceive nor be deceived. So we're believing them on authority, and we're not believing them at all on the basis of natural reason. There's no way that you could work out that God is a Trinity by natural reason. Not only could no human being work that out, but no angel could work that out. Not only no actually existing angel, but even God couldn't create an angel with an intellect capable of deducing by natural reason the fact that God is three persons in one substance. That's why it is a divinizing truth, because to believe, to know through faith that God is triune is to share in knowledge truly proper to the divine nature itself, and therefore to share in God's knowledge of himself and to be adopted as a son, because the concept by which God knows himself is the eternal Logos, and you are participating in that concept through the revelation of the Trinity. So you cannot therefore believe some things but not others that have been revealed by God, because to question or deny something which is revealed by God is to necessarily deny that it was revealed by God, because God by definition is infinite in all perfections and can neither deceive nor be deceived. So to deny one article of faith is to in fact deny them all qua articles of faith, and insofar as you believe any of them, to believe them for completely different reasons of social convention, or because you imagine that you were able to prove them by natural reason or something along those lines, but not as a result of faith. So the heresy destroys the virtue of faith. It arises from uniquely intense individual subjective malice, and it causes greater harm to those who are the victims of it, those who are not evangelized when they could have been, than any other crime or sin. This is why the church takes the matter so seriously. So, Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, converted to Christianity in the year 312. He wasn't, as it happens, baptized until his deathbed in 337, but he embraced Christianity in 312. He did not, however, turn the Roman Empire into a Christian or a Catholic state. He simply personally became a Christian, and it became advantageous politically to share the same religion as the emperor, and every emperor after him, with the exception of his nephew Julian the Apostate, were Christians of one sort or another, some of them heretics, sometimes quite seriously so, but nevertheless they professed to be Christians. Until the year 380, when the Emperor Theodosius became emperor, and he issued what's called the Edict of Thessalonica, which in the end would end up being the first paragraph of Roman law when Roman law was codified by the Emperor Justinian. And this law, the Edict of Thessalonica, established the Catholic faith as the religion of the Roman Empire. It said that only those persons were to call themselves Christians, and only those gatherings were to be called churches which belonged to those who adhered to the faith of the Pontifex Damasus. That was the then Pope, Pope Damasus, and he was referred to, strikingly, as Pontifex, which was previously the title of the emperor as the head of the Roman religion. So the emperor was, in a certain sense, implicitly divesting himself of the position of principal religious magistrate in the Roman Empire, and recognizing that role as in fact belonging to the Bishop of Rome. And that is, Theodosius explains, they profess the one God, triune, in three persons, equal in majesty and dignity. So Theodosius goes on to say that those who reject or depart from, so he's not dealing with people who never converted to Christianity in the first place, they are not in any way covered by this decree, quite correctly, because the church has absolutely no coercive power over those who are not baptized. But those who depart from this faith are to be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and their gatherings are to be called conventicles and not churches, and they will suffer in the first place the divine chastisement, and secondly such punishment as it shall please us to inflict upon them. He doesn't say what that is. That's the end of the decree. So with that decree in 380, Theodosius establishes that the Roman Empire claims the right to punish by coercive punishments erring members of the faithful. Now, that such a right exists in the hands of the church, of the spiritual power, is actually still enshrined in the Code of Canon Law, the 1983 Code of Canon Law issued by John Paul II. Canon 1311 says that the church has the innate right to punish erring members of the faithful with coercive penalties. Properly speaking, St. Robert Bellarmine explains, when this right is exercised by the civil power, in the case that we're talking about the Roman Empire, it does so only as the instrument of the church. Whether Theodosius would agree with that or not, who knows? Shortly after that, a slightly irregular Western emperor called Magnus Maximus executed a heretic called Priscillian. This was the first instance of such a thing happening. There's a little bit of a dispute around it. It may be that he was in fact executed for sorcery, but we'll bracket that controversy for now. His execution was objected to by St. Martin of Tours and St. Ambrose at the time. So the idea of employing such draconian means to discipline erring members of the faithful has been controversial to some degree or another throughout the history of the church, even though it has prevailed for long periods of time. A century or so later, St. Leo the Great, who, like St. Ambrose, is a doctor of the church, he explicitly stated that this form of discipline was legitimate in principle. However, it should be said that it was very, very rarely executed. The Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, excuse me, he did execute some Manichaean heretics by burning at the stake. Again, this isn't quite as definitive an example of the later practice as we might think, because in fact that penalty was applied to Manichees even by the pagan Roman Empire before the conversion of Constantine. The penalty of burning isn't in fact, although as we saw it does exist in the Old Testament, it isn't in fact derived from Old Testament sources historically in regard to heretics. It was used by the Romans to punish lèse-majesté, the crime of offending against the dignity of the emperor. It was seen that once the Catholic faith had been adopted as the official religio of the Roman Empire, it was offensive to the majesty of the emperor for people to attempt to corrupt it. That's why the penalty of burning was applied. But as I say, Justinian burnt some Manichees, but that had also been done by pagan Roman emperors, so whether it's a specifically Christian act or not completely clear. The much later emperor, Eastern Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, in the late 11th century, he also executed some Paulician heretics in the same fashion. But those are very rare instances. The fact that they're known about is precisely because they very, very rarely occurred. It was in the period immediately after that, 12th and particularly the 13th century, that the execution of heretics began to become a significant phenomenon in the West in general, reaching quite a pitch in the 13th century. In the next segment, we're going to look at why that happened and what the institutional means by which it happened were.